Welcome to the Spirit Alive program today. My name is Larry Sault. I'm from the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. My pleasure, absolutely my pleasure, to host this program, section of the program today. Just to give you a prelude into why we're here is about 6 years ago, a number of pastors and leaders, native pastors and leaders from across Ontario came together at Six Nations. Pastor Joe Gilbert from Walpole Island and myself headed up the group. Just wanted to come together in terms of talking about Native leadership in the church world specifically, and obviously leading into chiefs and councils. And so it's my pleasure today to pick up 6 years later on the conversation of Native leadership in this country, in Canada, specifically here in Ontario. We will probably get into some of the issues of politics, spirituality, and of course corporate leadership in our Indian world. And it's my pleasure today to introduce former Chief Joseph Gilbert from the Walpole Island First Nation. He's also spent many, many years in ministry, traveling ministry. He's a local pastor at the Walpole Island First Nation, and I'd like to welcome Joseph Gilbert today. Also with Joseph Gilbert is a very dear friend of mine and gentleman that has traveled with me in the Canadian Arctic, traveled with me in many circles, in our native circles, Pastor Jerry Cox from New Covenant Living Church in Jackson, Michigan. A man of the world. He's a missionary, man of the world, supports missionaries all over the world and has been doing that for the last 30 years. So we want to talk about leadership in our First Nation community and pick back up. I guess this is what we'll call a springboard into from 6 years ago. Joseph Gilbert, talk to us.
Thank you, Larry. Well, again, it's my privilege to have the opportunity by way of this program to address these issues and talk about the issues, because leadership is something that is needed in various venues of our community life, in business, in church, in council, in schools, all the key elements that structure our community life. And I've had the privilege and the honor of leading in ministry for a number of years. And then the door opened for me to be able to serve my community in the capacity of a council member, and as well as chief. And the challenge of leadership is, I believe, trying to be able to keep the right approach, the attitude, always keeping the right focus of why you are in that position. From a biblical perspective, and I think also from our cultural perspective as First Nations people, leadership was actually like servitude, because you worked for the benefit of those you represent. And it's the same way within the context of church. There's always a need for leadership to be developed and trained in the sense of them having the right principles, motivation, and why they are serving. What is it about? I think in leadership, because of the authority, powers, or responsibilities given to you, you have to confront the reality that it can go to your head. It can you can lose the focus of it in the sense that it's no longer about those you represent, but more about yourself. And coming into leadership, I think there's also the challenge that we face of self-preserving our positions. I've seen that. I had to confront that in my own personal experience in leadership. And when that happens, I think it can lead to people becoming very competitive with one another. I've seen it. And one of the principles that I learned in the context of leadership is to recognize where your authority ultimately comes from. In the context of the church, naturally that comes from our Lord. In the context of political leadership, it comes from the people you represent. They delegate that responsibility to you. And so we see many times a lack of leadership in the sense of having the right motivation, the right focus, what you're there for. We've talked about that over the last 6 years in the context of the church. And sometimes the problem of leadership in a community, in a church, for example, is not so much the fault of the leader, but of those that preceded those leaders, who didn't lay the foundation, who didn't train them, who didn't model what good leadership should be about. And I think that's something that we've talked about, and we want to call attention to that, because we're not always going to be here, but the need for leadership will be. And how do we pass on the right example, the right, trying to inspire within people, the right motivation for serving. And so these are some of the things that concern me at the time where I'm at in my life. My opportunity to serve as far as life goes or years go, the greater part of it is behind me. And so I'm looking at how do I invest those things, those principles into others, because any kind of leadership that I've demonstrated, been able to achieve, was because of the investment others made in me.
So we'll pick up there, Joe, when we come back. But I'd like to, Jerry, just introduce yourself, say hello to the viewing audience. Yeah. A little bit of experience. I know you've traveled the world. Just tell us a little bit about your experience as a pastor in world missions.
Well, I've certainly had the privilege of it. Didn't come by the eloquence of our pastor Joseph here. A lot of his statements, I agree with all of them. But I was just a simple guy that said yes to Jesus, And when I got saved February 10th, 1974, I heard the word go, and so I started going. I might have gone in a lot of spin-arounds.
Chasing rabbits.
Chasing rabbits, trying to find out where that goal was. But eventually we surrendered to the will of God and started a fellowship in Jackson, Michigan, in New Covenant Living. Had the privilege now for 37 years being a pastor there. And it didn't take long to find out that leadership is kind of a simple thing. When you look back, is anybody following? And so you can call yourself a leader, but if nobody's following, then there's maybe a problem there. So we've just decided to roll up our sleeves, go anywhere the Lord told us to go, and it's taken us around the world and have many good friends around the world. And one of my elements was my first trip to Mexico was to see that the need was greater than what I even could even imagine, and so God spoke to my heart and said in these latter days that He would raise up churches that would have a mission vision. And too much times, as Pastor Joseph was talking, we center in on our own fellowship so much that we forget there's a whole world out there.
Yeah.
And so we thank God today that we've just been able to raise up a good church and have a good mission program. We support missions. Now we've connected other ministries with us, and so we're able to do, want to put 1,000 flight to put 10,000. So we're able to do a lot more than I could ever do in the little city of Jackson, Michigan.
So we want to come back to the discussion about missions, simply because it's almost to the fact of we're at a point where we want to see our native leaders invest back in our native leaders. Joseph, is that right?
Yes.
That's sort of the conversation that we've had with respect to missions and helping each other pay it forward sort of thing. But let's come back to traditions versus biblical principle. Mm-hmm. When we talk about, when we heard our elders over the years talk about creation story within our own ranks in the traditional side, it's almost biblical. And when we talk about modeling, mentoring, and multiplication, I see that as sort of the role of the church as well, in terms of a model and a mentor and multiplication. Mm-hmm. So how do we see that in the traditional circles, we'll say? Because, Joseph and many native leaders will know that there's schism, I'll call it for now, between the church and Christian leadership.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a challenge in a community, and from a personal level, being a Christian believer from the time I was the age of 10, and getting into elected position came many years later. When I was in my 40s or more, and growing up in the sense of some of the influence that affected the church in the sense that our identity as Native people was wrong, was evil, was something I had to work through.
When did you first identify that? What year did sort of that come to light and say, okay, what's going on here?
Well, quite frankly, in my home, in my life, we weren't taught about our identity as Native people. My parents spoke the language. I grew up under the influence of the language until just shortly after I was 11, or going on 11 years of age. And that came about as a result of me being taken from my home and placed into foster homes for about 7 years. I found out later that the reason my family, my parents in particular, didn't speak the language is because of the residential impact, residential school. My father was from Michigan side, Ottawa, from the Grand Traverse area, and he was sent to the boarding school, as they used to call it, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and went through a lot of the onslaught against trying to strip them of their identity as Native people. I wasn't brought up understanding or recognizing my identity as an Anishinaabe. And when I look back on it, what might be considered as very infantile, foolish, or silly was the fact that my struggles with my identity as a Native person was influenced by the fact that when television came into our community, one of our neighbors had a television, we'd go watch the programs, and sometimes I'd get to go to the movies. The Indians always lost. They were always painted as the bad guys. And knowing that I was Indian, as we used to call it, I didn't want to betray that. So in my own imagination, when I would play, I would identify myself as an Indian cowboy. And that's,
You were dual.
Well, I was confused. I believe that's really what it was.
Okay.
And at one point, I was sent into a training school. And when I was there, I remember one black gentleman, a boy, we were very young boys at the time, who asked me the question, "What kind of Indian are you?" The only ones I had seen in the movies were the Apaches, I'm Apache. I had no personal identity of who I was. And by the grace of God, and I say that very respectfully, by the grace of God, when I left evangelism to concentrate what I was doing in ministry in my community, I got nominated and elected to council. That was in 1990. And I remember going to some of the meetings where they'll have ceremonial openings. I didn't know how to cope with that. I didn't know how to be there. It was like it was a violation of my Christianity. And I struggled with it. But fortunately, I was able to ask somebody who was a Christian, is a Christian, who understood how to do that and gave me advice and counsel, and it helped me. I've said many times in the context of my service as chief and as a council member to my community that there is no way that I could ever repay the community for the investment they made in me. What I did as a council member, as a chief, pales in comparison to what I received. Because an individual as a chief doesn't do it all. It's a council. It's a collective process of decision and direction setting. With myself being exposed to that aspect of who I am, what my identity as an Anishinaabe person really confronted me with some struggles. Here in Thunder Bay, for example, that 1990, if you remember the Oka crisis, I was a young counselor elected in June, and here in the AFN assembly up on Mount McKay here. And at that time, there were runners coming into the meetings, talking and updating us on what was happening at Oka. And there was a great deal of tension and a great deal of speeches made by people who were well experienced in politics. I'm only a month into this. I had never even served on a committee in my community. And I remember standing on Mount McKay and looking down on the city here, thinking to myself, if we go to war against the government, I've got friends in the city. How do I deal with that in the context of my faith and the commandment of God to love my neighbor as myself and to even love my enemies? How do I do that? I questioned whether I had been maybe taking the wrong road in serving on council or leaving my name to stand for election. But through that process, I received a great education as to my identity. I am not ashamed that I'm Anishinaabe. I'm not ashamed of my culture. But culture is not something that remains cut in stone. It evolves with interaction with other cultures. We adapt, we change our cultural approach to how we live, where we live. I personally prefer living in a home with central heat than living in a wigwam where I have to go and, collect wood. I prefer having meals that I can take out of the fridge rather than having to tramp out in the snow and the cold to try to find something to eat for the day. So culture changes by impact with other cultures. And so when we look at where we are and this rift between, apparent rift between the church and traditional beliefs, the principal teachings, the grandfather teachings, as I've heard them taught and explained, absolutely have no conflict with what Jesus taught about relationship with other people. In a nutshell, if you take what he said, do unto others or treat others as you want them to treat you, to me, that summarizes the real objective of the grandfather's teachings.
So we've you and I have both heard this whole issue about the white man's church and the white man's religion, and here we have a white brother sitting with us. You have a comment, Jerry, about skin color, and when you talk about spirituality, and talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Well, I don't make any excuses for it. I was born in a little town of Hillsdale, Michigan. I see my first black person when I was about 10. Met my first Native American maybe a little later on in life, but I wasn't brought up in a home that made differences. Small town in a small community, and but whether it was somebody being beat up or somebody this or that, I always seem to kind of gravitate to wanting to make the difference of somebody being picked on
because of injustice.
Yeah, injustice, and so when we started in the ministry, it seems like I'd like to have been, in some of the nicer places. I ended up in the bush of Africa and, in Timbuktu all the time, but you throw me up in the air and I always seem to end up with an indigenous population. And that's just who I am. It's just, it's not something I'm trying to make happen. I just feel that everybody has a right to hear about Jesus.
Yeah.
And if we go on a basis of right and wrongs, it's an endless pit.
So has this led us, Joe, in terms of the political agenda in the 70s and 80s? We've seen the government of Canada, moving, well, we know why the Indian problem, we got this Indian problem, and let's put some money over here to the traditions. That's the big issue. Mm-hmm. Is that where that rift started in terms of the pots of money that was available through government for powwows in the 70s and 80s that started to evolve? And then it sort of led to, that's a white man's religion because of residential school, those types of issues?
I don't know if that's the way I understand it or view it. Any one of us, when we've been in a relationship, if that somehow those involved with us in that relationship betrayed us, betrayed our trust, or turned out to be not what they projected to be or claimed to be, there is no question that the gospel of Christ, the church, has been part of our native people in Canada and in the United States for hundreds of years. And our people accepted the message of the gospel. They responded to the call of Christ, to the Spirit of God calling them. When the whole issue of the residential school and some of the betrayals and, how would I put it, the not honoring treaties, not honoring the relationship as it was originally established, that was lost sight of. And it became the norm. We grew up under that understanding, maybe that, I don't know what you'd call it, understanding or not, but it was the norm for our people to be controlled, dominated. Our culture, our ways assaulted. When it first happened, I'm sure the elders of the time spoke against it. And when it came to the residential school, maybe they couldn't change the elders, they couldn't change the adults, so they went after the children, because that's the future. And many, you look at the years that residential school was in place, it became the norm in the way people lived, because that's the way it was. And when leaders, rightfully, Native leaders, council members, chiefs, began to call attention to this, and the betrayal, the atrocities that took place, the church that had been part of the communities now became suspect. There was like a sense, we've been betrayed by these very people. Churches were involved. And I think that's one of the things that caused a rift. People began turning back, to spirituality in the context of maybe what it was in the past.
When you say people turning back, some guys that we know that used to be preachers, right?
Yeah.
Going the traditional route.
Well, when you're confronted with betrayal, you want to get away from those that betrayed you, especially if they're being singled out, because if you don't, you might be viewed as compromising or betraying principles that, of relationship that should not be violated. I think that was part of it. And I had to deal with that. I can recall being chief when I was confronted, because I was an evangelist. I traveled across Canada to many of these Native communities through the years. And when I got elected, a lot of them knew me as a preacher. And they thought I was going to come across as a Bible thumper, judgmental in my attitudes. But thank God that when I did get elected, it was later in my life, where more mature in my thinking, more mature in how I relate to people. I thank God that it was later in life. And so among the things, I looked at is, how do I relate to this? How do I answer this? There's one chief asked me, he said, how is it that you as a chief, a representative of your community, can espouse the church, espouse the white man's religion that was so destructive to our culture and our identity as Native people? And my response was this: that was not what Jesus Christ did, because he did not destroy anybody's culture. God gave us our distinctives as nations. Our cultures evolved, as we experience life and situations. And culture in and of itself, I don't believe is evil. It's what it's viewed as, if your culture is different from my culture, naturally my culture is the plumb line. And I think when the gospel was brought to North America, that was the attitude in which the early contact people, they came. I learned to speak kind of bluntly, and I think some people in the church world who knew me as a minister thought I was betraying or going astray. But I had to confront these truthful historical things that happened. And I can remember in speeches as the chief speaking to this issue, they came with their cross, they came with their flag, and they took everything that was ours. That's reality. That happened in that context. They felt justified in doing it. But Christ himself does not destroy anybody's culture. He liberates that culture in the context of making sure that not only do I honor the people in my own community, I mean, there's differences among us in politics, as you know. There can be vast differences of opinions or focus or agendas. That spreads, you know, when you deal with people in a broader context. We all have our opinions and so forth. One of the things that the Spirit of God taught me in running for council is to take this approach. I am not running against anyone. I am running for a position. I'm not going to seek to destroy some other candidate who is running for the same position I am, to knock them down, to discredit them. Why? Because it's the people that have to make the choice. I brought myself to the place where I said in my heart, they've got to make the choice. Here's the candidates. I'm not going to try to destroy them. Let the people make the choice. If they don't want me, I'm fine with that. I'm not going to feel defeated. It's just a process. And so that was one way that I functioned within my community, and I encouraged others to take the same approach. Why? Because the person who gets elected, if I come against them and seek to destroy their reputation or their image in my community, and they get elected, there will come a time when I'll have to go to that person and ask for their help in different areas.
So there's a lot of things we could talk about. This discussion is so vast in First Nations, Indigenous communities in Canada, but we want to pick back up on leadership in the First Nation communities.
We would like to give you an opportunity to ask Jesus into your life if you haven't done that. Say this simple prayer. Jesus, come into my heart. Be my Lord and my Savior. Friends, if you prayed that prayer, contact the information on the screen, and we will love to send you some material to help you in your new walk with Christ.